Bruce Lee was challenged by a furious kung fu master. 9 seconds later, every move became legendary. By the time the crowd understood what had happened, it was already over. 9 seconds had passed. The challenger was still standing, but the certainty had left his posture, and the noise around him had thinned into a careful silence. No dramatic strike had been seen. No wild exchange to recount. Only a brief shift, a small redirection, and a man known for fury discovering, publicly and without injury, that none of his strength could find its mark. Those who witnessed it would later agree on only one thing. The outcome felt decided long before the movement began. The hall was long, narrow, and lined with windows that allowed sunlight to spill onto polished wooden floors. Dust motes drifted in the light, moving slowly as if time itself had decided to pause for a moment. It was a place where every step, every bow, and every strike carried weight beyond the immediate action. The walls were unadorned, save for a few scrolls, names and maxims of fighters who had long since passed, their presence lingering as quiet testimony. In this city, martial reputation was currency. It moved in whispers from one student to another, from one neighborhood to the next, growing as it traveled. Size, lineage, and the strength of one's technique mattered, but more enduring than all of that was the story. Who had faced whom? Who had bowed to whom? Who had never bowed at all? Bruce Lee's name had arrived recently, carried by subtle reports from out of town. Those who had seen him move described something precise, economical, almost unsettling in its calm. The word spread slowly. A man who taught without show, yet left a lasting impression. The local master, on the other hand, needed no introduction. His presence dominated the room before he spoke. Broad shoulders, hands that bore the faint scars of repeated strikes, eyes that measured without pause. He had cultivated authority through decades of visible, disciplined effort. Students and onlookers had learned early that challenging him required not just skill, but an acceptance that the rules of the hall were his to enforce. Yet, authority alone does not prevent curiosity. The moment Bruce arrived, there was an almost imperceptible shift. Eyes that had once scanned for weakness now lingered in quiet observation. Bruce did not announce his presence. He moved through the space with the ease of someone who did not need the room to notice him, yet whose attention captured it anyway. He spoke in measured tones when asked, offering corrections or suggestions, but never the flourish of self-importance. In this environment, quiet mastery had its own gravity. Students whispered to one another, not in fear, but in anticipation. The atmosphere was dense with expectation, yet strangely still. A silence that did not demand, but suggested, that something significant was about to occur. The hall's design encouraged observation. Benches ran along the edges, and the floor itself bore faint scars from years of repetitive motion. Every crack and scratch told a story of persistence and authority, of small victories that accumulated into lasting respect. Those who stood along the walls understood instinctively that this was more than a test of strength. It was a theater for judgment, where every movement would speak louder than words, and every decision could echo long after the moment passed. Bruce's calm contrasted with the environment in a subtle way. He did not seek the attention of the room, nor did he avoid it. He simply occupied it, like a quiet current flowing beneath the surface of murmuring expectation. The local master, sensing the presence of someone not immediately measurable by size or tradition, adjusted slightly. There was no display yet, only the acknowledgement that a new variable had entered a system long considered stable. By the time the whispers reached their quiet crescendo, the hall had become an arena in a sense beyond physicality. Reputation, authority, and curiosity had all converged into a tension that required no words. It was understood that this was not merely a meeting of two men, but a confrontation of methods, philosophies, and the quiet power that comes with mastery fully internalized. The stage was set, though no one would yet know how swiftly it would resolve, or how permanently it would alter the perception of strength within those walls. The hall had shown many challenges over the years, but none had arrived like this, silent, controlled, and almost invisible in its inevitability. The tension of anticipation, more than any clash, marked the beginning. The chapter closes on a quiet note. The room waits, and the audience, conditioned by years of expectation, leans forward, not in eagerness, but in a shared, unspoken recognition that a shift is imminent. The local master stepped forward, not with a gesture of anger, but with the certainty of someone whose presence alone had settled countless disputes over decades. His eyes measured Bruce with the precision of a craftsman inspecting a new tool, curious, cautious, and quietly evaluating whether it could match the work he had spent a lifetime perfecting. There was no announcement, no declaration of challenge. The room's tension had already demanded a meeting, and both men simply acknowledged it. Bruce did not mirror the intensity. He stood upright, calm, hands relaxed at his sides, posture neither defensive nor provocative. He understood the weight of the room, the silent insistence of expectation, and moved with an economy that spoke louder than any speech. Observers later described it as the absence of excess. He made no claim to authority, yet the mere fact of his stillness seemed to assert a different kind of mastery, one that did not rely on history or reputation, but on a confidence that could only come from internalized control. The local master tested first in subtle ways. A step forward, a shift of weight, a measured extension of the arm, small motions designed to provoke reaction, to measure instinct, to see whether Bruce would mirror, resist, or falter. Bruce responded not with equal force, but with precise adjustment. Where the master expected resistance or confrontation, Bruce provided only space, guidance, and redirection. The room noticed immediately. Nothing was wasted, nothing theatrical, nothing aggressive. Every subtle movement served to clarify the limits of the moment, not to dominate it visibly. Students whispered among themselves, but in hushed tones. The difference between the two men was obvious even without contact. One carried the weight of visible, earned authority. The other carried the quiet gravity of absolute control over his own body and perception. The tension was not a shout, but a still pressure that filled the hall. No one could articulate exactly what would happen, yet all understood that a decisive moment had been encoded in these silent gestures. The challenger's intent was clear, to assert dominance in the only way he knew. Bruce's response was equally clear, but in a manner that could not be anticipated. There was no preparation for spectacle, no attempt to dramatize skill. Observers later recalled that it was as if Bruce had already seen every motion the master could make, and in that calm, almost imperceptible foresight, had chosen the minimal path to resolve it. Even before a formal exchange, the psychological landscape had shifted. The master's eyes flickered briefly, a subtle recognition that the space around him was no longer entirely under his command. He remained upright, face composed, but there was a shift in the room's energy. Expectation had begun to tilt. The students sensed it immediately, though they could not articulate why. The room was still, yet full of quiet recognition. The challenger might dominate tradition, but Bruce occupied an authority that tradition could not contain. Bruce made no claim, no gesture beyond his measured stance. He did not provoke, he did not challenge. He simply allowed the room and the master himself to understand that the rules had changed, if only slightly. Every observer who later recounted the event spoke of this moment as one of silent negotiation. It was not a confrontation of fists, but of presence. The outcome was not yet determined, yet inevitability began to cast its shadow. By the end of this chapter of quiet interaction, the hall had transformed. The authority that had once seemed absolute now existed alongside a new variable, one that required patience, observation, and an acknowledgement that mastery could be subtle, indirect, and undeniable. And in that space, all who witnessed understood that the approaching moment would not be measured by force alone, but by clarity, control, and a method so precise it seemed almost invisible. The tension has been established. The audience, the challenger, and even the space itself recognize that something decisive is imminent, but still unspoken. By the time the room began to fill with spectators, the atmosphere had shifted from anticipation to a taut, almost physical stillness. Students lined the edges of the hall, leaning slightly forward, their eyes tracing the subtle cues of weight, stance, and breath. It was not curiosity alone that held them. This was a shared recognition that the event they were about to witness could quietly redefine their understanding of skill and authority. Whispers circulated, but even these were measured. Comparisons of size, lineage, and prior victories were offered in the kind of hushed tones one reserves for sacred knowledge. Some spoke of the local master's decades of experience, the scars etched into his knuckles and the stories that accompanied them. Others murmured about Bruce, whose reputation had arrived silently from elsewhere, carried on the accounts of those who had seen him move in other cities. Yet no one could articulate precisely what made him different. Only that difference was palpable. The local master shifted, testing the silence. A footstep, a turn of the head, a slight adjustment in stance. All performed with the discipline of someone who had conditioned both body and mind to command attention. Bruce responded without effort, his eyes tracking subtly, his weight never wasted. There was no tension in his shoulders, no outward flexing of muscle, only a calm attentiveness that contrasted with the energy radiating from the challenger. The room felt the contrast immediately. One man radiated intensity, the other, absolute control. The quiet was not empty. It was a pressure, a presence that seemed to compress time and expectation into a small, almost imperceptible volume. Every observer felt it differently. Some in their chest, others in their stomachs, all in their awareness. Conversations ceased entirely as the psychological stakes became tangible. Every breath seemed louder, every movement heavier, yet no one spoke aloud. The silence itself became a language, one that carried the weight of judgment, anticipation, and the inevitability of what was about to unfold. Bruce's stillness invited observation, not action. He did not seek to intimidate. He did not react to posturing or provocation. The master's eyes flickered occasionally, searching for a hint of weakness, a sign of hesitation, but found none. In this way, tension was built not by noise or spectacle, but by the absence of it. The hall itself seemed to lean forward with the spectators, sensing a moment that could not be altered by force alone. Those closest later recalled the subtle shifts that went unnoticed by casual observers. A slight turn of the foot, a micro-adjustment in weight distribution. The way Bruce's gaze met the challengers without challenge, without surrender, each act quietly unsettled assumptions. The local master, used to commanding immediate recognition through presence and controlled aggression, felt the room's perception subtly realigning. Even without a single strike, the momentum of expectation was beginning to favor the one who demanded nothing yet held everything. In these moments, the audience learned a lesson they would not fully name until later. Tension could exist without noise, dominance could emerge without confrontation, and authority could be recognized not by volume or size, but by precision and calm inevitability. Every whispered prediction, every studied assumption, was quietly overturned before the first formal exchange even began. By the end of this chapter, the room was still, not in anticipation of action, but in acknowledgement of control. The local master remained upright, composed, yet the quiet recognition had begun to seep in. Bruce was not merely present. He was already shaping the encounter, silently, inevitably. The 9-second moment that would follow seemed embedded in this silence, preordained, and yet impossible to describe in advance. The tension has now reached its peak without a single outward conflict. The hall, the challenger, and the spectators all occupy the same suspended space, waiting for the demonstration that will quietly resolve the question of authority and skill. When the moment finally arrived, it was over almost as soon as it began. The exchange did not unfold like a fight. There was no clash of aggression, no flurry of strikes. Instead, it was a precise, almost imperceptible negotiation of space and intent. Observers later struggled to recount the sequence accurately, not because it lacked clarity, but because clarity itself had been applied with such economy that the human eye could barely follow it. The local master advanced first, as if instinctively claiming the floor. Every movement carried the weight of experience. Controlled, forceful, deliberate. Bruce responded with neither resistance nor anticipation. Instead, he shifted with minimal motion, a subtle turn of the wrist, a slight adjustment of his stance, and a redirection that seemed almost incidental. The master's energy collided not with another force, but with absence, a carefully placed void in which his own momentum dissolved. It lasted 9 seconds. Not 9 minutes, not 9 movements, but 9 seconds in which every attempt by the challenger to assert dominance failed quietly, almost politely. Bruce did not strike. He did not trap. He did not overpower. He simply existed in the precise location, at the precise angle, in the precise moment necessary to render every effort ineffective. Witnesses would later say the term overpowered did not apply. The word that came closest was outmaneuvered, though even that felt inadequate. The crowd noticed small details. A foot lifted, then subtly guided aside. A hand extended, then redirected without tension. The master's eyes flickered, registering, perhaps for the first time, that his methods, the ones that had commanded obedience for decades, were insufficient here. Each gesture Bruce made carried no flourish, no claim to victory. Yet it was absolute in its authority. The room's air shifted in those seconds. Some onlookers inhaled sharply, as if the very motion of the demonstration disturbed them physically. Others exhaled, realizing before the master did that the encounter was already resolved in its essence. There was no struggle, no shouting, no outward display of dominance. The only struggle was internal, the challenger wrestling with the recognition that his certainty had been quietly dismantled, piece by piece, almost invisibly. And then it ended. The local master remained standing, upright, composed, but subtly altered. His weight no longer carried the same unassailable authority. The hall's observers exhaled collectively, not in relief, but in acknowledgement. They had seen what had been said without words, what had been taught without demonstration. Control, clarity, and economy were more decisive than size, strength, or reputation. Bruce did not step forward to claim victory. He simply shifted slightly, relaxed, and allowed the moment to settle. The silence that followed was not emptiness. It was resonance. It lingered in the polished wood of the floor, in the faint dust motes drifting through the sunlight, in the steady breathing of every witness. For 9 seconds, a man had quietly redefined what it meant to hold power over another, and then returned the room to calm observation, leaving only the imprint of inevitability. The local master, who had entered with the certainty of tradition and decades of earned respect, now understood the magnitude of subtle mastery. Not through humiliation, not through spectacle, but through the quiet, measured disassembly of expectation. And in that recognition, the lesson began to seed itself. Authority can be challenged without confrontation. Dominance can be demonstrated without noise. And mastery, when fully internalized, manifests in ways that almost defy observation. 9 seconds had passed. The outcome was certain. The room, the students, the master himself, all now occupied a new understanding of what had just occurred. When the 9 seconds concluded, the hall did not erupt in cheers or exclamations. The silence remained, heavier now, textured with understanding rather than anticipation. The local master was still upright, still composed, yet those who had known him for years noticed a subtle shift. His shoulders, which had carried the certainty of authority for decades, now bore the weight of something unspoken. Recognition of a gap he could not close with force alone. He did not stumble. He did not bow. He did not speak. Yet those present, students, onlookers, even casual witnesses, could see the acknowledgement in the stillness of his stance. Every micro-expression, every slight adjustment in posture, conveyed more than words ever could. A quiet concession to a method, a presence, and a clarity that had made resistance unnecessary. In that moment, the hall became a mirror of understanding rather than a stage for spectacle. Bruce, for his part, did not claim the space. He did not assert triumph or invite attention. He allowed the silence to convey what was beyond argument. His presence had been sufficient. His subtle manipulation of space and motion had delivered the lesson without a single outward gesture of victory. Observers later described feeling that he had not just neutralized the master's challenge, but had also reshaped the perception of what mastery could look like. The demonstration was not of aggression, but of inevitability, an outcome that had been encoded into the room before a single strike had landed. Students shifted, some leaning forward, others straightening instinctively. The air was dense with reflection. The local master's gaze traveled across the faces of those around him, acknowledging the same realization they were having. The authority they had long revered was not diminished, but reframed. Force alone could not dictate outcome. Control, clarity, and precision, not spectacle or intimidation, defined the moment. Even the master students, trained to respect hierarchy and lineage, felt the recalibration. Some felt unease. Others felt a quiet awakening. They had come expecting a contest of strength or skill, yet what they witnessed was a subtle lesson in presence, timing, and efficiency. The room had become a classroom in motion, where observation replaced applause and reflection replaced excitement. For the local master, the recognition was personal. His fury, which had fueled decades of dominance, was still present but redirected. There was no anger, no frustration, only an inward understanding that his method, while effective within its own framework, could not contend with the subtlety of mastery demonstrated that day. The realization did not diminish him. It quietly expanded the definition of what could be achieved through discipline and observation. Bruce did not linger unnecessarily. He shifted his weight, his stance slightly relaxed, and allowed the moment to settle fully. The hall breathed collectively, as though the 9-second demonstration had realigned not just the participants, but the space itself. Silence carried the weight of the lesson, subtle yet undeniable. There was no fanfare, no dramatization, only the residue of inevitability left behind. Years later, those who had witnessed the encounter would recall this chapter as the moment when certainty gave way to quiet understanding. The local master remained a figure of respect, yet the event had planted an indelible seed. True authority is measured not by aggression, but by clarity, control, and the ability to resolve conflict without unnecessary motion. And in that seed, the essence of a legend quietly began to form. The room had returned to calm. The audience, the master, and Bruce himself occupied the same space. Yet all understood that something permanent had shifted. The demonstration had ended, but its impact lingered, subtle and profound. Years later, the hall had changed little in its physical form. The wooden floors still bore faint scars from decades of training. Sunlight still spilled through the windows in the same pattern, and the dust motes still drifted lazily in the air. Yet the memory of that 9-second encounter had seeped into the very fabric of the place, transforming how students and masters alike measured skill, authority, and presence. The local master continued to teach, his authority intact but subtly altered. He no longer relied solely on force or the weight of tradition to command respect. Those who trained under him spoke of a shift in his approach. More observation, more subtle correction, more acknowledgement that mastery could manifest quietly, without demonstration. The encounter had not diminished him. It had expanded his understanding, allowing him to pass on lessons that were as much about perception and restraint as about technique. Bruce's presence, though physically fleeting, became a touchstone. Students who had never seen him in person studied the stories told by those who had, the measured stance, the precise redirection, the economy of motion that rendered aggression irrelevant. The 9-second demonstration became a lesson in efficiency, a standard against which skill was measured without comparison or competition. Legends do not require embellishment. They require clarity, and this moment had it in abundance. The story spread beyond the hall. Martial artists in nearby cities recounted it quietly, emphasizing the subtlety rather than the spectacle. It became a model of psychological mastery. How to command perception, control motion, and unsettle certainty without confrontation. Teachers invoked it when correcting posture or timing, when discussing presence or economy of movement. The encounter transformed from an event into a method, a reference point that quietly reshaped practice and expectation. For the local master, the incident remained a personal anchor. He never framed it as defeat, nor did he elevate it as triumph. He would recount it with measured calm when asked, focusing on observation rather than action, on the clarity revealed in the brief interaction rather than on any outcome. Witnesses remembered this humility, noting that his authority grew not from exhibition, but from integration, the way he allowed the lesson to redefine his own approach. Bruce himself had long since moved beyond the hall, yet his influence lingered like a shadow across the floors. He had shown that dominance is not about overpowering. It is about occupying the right space, the right angle at the right moment. He demonstrated that efficiency and presence can be more decisive than aggression or tradition. And in doing so, he left behind a quiet standard, one that generations would study not for its spectacle, but for its inevitability. Decades later, the story is still told in the hall, in small corners of conversation, in careful recounting by those who value mastery over noise. It is told not as a story of one man defeating another, but as a moment in which the subtle, precise application of skill quietly shifted perception, forever altering the understanding of authority in that room. The 9 seconds remain immortal, not because they were dramatic, but because they were true, measured, and unavoidable. The legend endures because the lesson is observed rather than preached. Students walk the same floors, feel the same sunlight, and drift through the same quiet dust, yet carry with them the understanding that mastery can be silent, inevitability can be demonstrated without confrontation, and presence can be more commanding than motion. That is why, decades later, Bruce's name is still spoken in that hall. Not in praise, not in hype, but as a benchmark of subtle authority and enduring clarity. In the end, the story leaves its witnesses in reflection, not celebration. The air seems to hold the echo of 9 seconds that quietly redefined expectation. And in that echo, the lesson lives, unspoken but undeniable, shaping how generations perceive mastery, presence, and the quiet power of precision. The story closes on quiet momentum. The hall, the master, and those who train there continue, yet the moment remains, as permanent as the floorboards and as intangible as the dust drifting through sunlight. The 9 seconds became more than an event. They became a standard, a legacy, a lesson that will outlast anyone who witnessed it directly.